There's a sentence somewhere in the back of your skull that never quite finished itself. Maybe it was something you meant to say to someone earlier today, a reply that arrived in your mind 3 hours too late to be useful. Maybe it's a small task, half remembered, sitting there without a period at the end of it. And right now, in the quiet, it's turning itself over again. Not loudly, not urgently, just present. The way a dish left in the sink is present, even when you're in another room and not looking at it. You didn't invite it back. That's worth noticing. You were lying still, eyes closed, doing everything that's supposed to signal to a body that it's time to stop. And yet, here's this thought, walking back in through a door you didn't remember leaving open. It's a strange kind of company, the thoughts that show up at night. They rarely knock. They just arrive, sit down, and wait to be noticed. This is such a common experience that it barely needs describing, and yet almost no one describes it accurately, even to themselves. Most people, lying there with a mind that won't quite settle, reach for the same explanation. Something is wrong with me. I'm too anxious. I think too much. I should be better at relaxing than this. It's a very human response, to take a shared and ordinary event and turn it into a personal verdict. But what's actually happening in that moment has very little to do with willpower, and a great deal to do with how attention itself is built. Here's a way to think about it. During the day, your attention behaves something like a spotlight on a very busy stage. There are emails to answer, conversations to track, traffic to notice, decisions to make about lunch, about deadlines, about what someone meant by that look they gave you in the hallway. The spotlight has to keep moving because the stage keeps demanding it. Your attention is, in a sense, employed. It has a job, and the job has structure. Meetings end, tasks get completed, one thing visibly gives way to the next. The spotlight rarely lingers because something else is always tugging it along. At night, the stage empties out. The meetings are done. The traffic is gone. The emails have stopped, or at least stopped requiring instant reply. And the spotlight, which has been working all day, doesn't simply switch off the moment the demands do. It's still on. It still wants to move. But now, there's nothing external left to organize where it goes. So it turns inward, the only remaining stage available to it, and it starts wandering through whatever is left lying around back there. The unfinished sentence, the small task, the memory of an odd exchange from 9 hours ago that meant nothing at the time, and now, oddly, means everything. This is sometimes called the default mode of the brain, a name given by researchers who noticed, somewhat by accident, that certain regions didn't quiet down during rest the way they'd expected. They'd assumed that when a task ended, the relevant brain activity would simply fall silent, the way a room goes dark when you flip a switch. Instead, they found a different pattern lighting up, one connected to self-referential thought, to memory, to imagining conversations, and revisiting old ones. It wasn't absence. It was a switch to a different kind of presence. The brain, it turned out, doesn't really do off. It does different. That distinction matters more than it might seem to at first. If your brain had an off switch, then lying awake with thoughts circling would genuinely mean the switch was broken, or that you'd forgotten how to use it. But if what's actually happening is a shift from one mode of attention to another,
from outward scanning to inward wandering, then the nighttime mind isn't malfunctioning. It's just doing the next thing on its list, the way it always does, except the list has changed shape now that the day's demands are gone. Think of a river that's been rushing along a fairly narrow, well-defined channel all day, pushed along by embankments on either side. The schedule, the obligations, the other people it has to accommodate. At night, the channel opens up, the banks fall away, and the water, instead of stopping, spreads out. It moves slower, in more directions, pooling here, trickling there, finding low points it never had time to notice before. To someone watching from the bank, it might look aimless, even a little worrying. Where is all that water going? But it isn't lost. It isn't malfunctioning. It's simply behaving the way water behaves when the terrain changes. Your thoughts at night are a bit like that spreading water. During the day, urgency and other people's needs act as the embankments, keeping your attention moving in a mostly forward direction. At night, urgency drops away, and thought spreads into corners it didn't have room for before. The half-finished sentence gets its turn. The small worry that got interrupted by a phone call at 2 p.m. finally gets to finish its thought. This isn't your mind turning against you. It's your mind doing something closer to inventory, quietly checking what's still open, what still needs somewhere to go. It helps to remember that for most of human history, this quiet hour wasn't seen as a problem to be solved. Before the widespread use of artificial light, many people slept in two segments, waking for an hour or so in the middle of the night before returning to a second stretch of sleep. Historians who've studied old letters, court records, and household diaries from a few centuries back have found this pattern described almost casually as an unremarkable part of the night, a period sometimes called the watch, used for quiet thinking, prayer, conversation with a partner, or simply lying in the dark with one's own mind.
Nobody was reaching for a solution to it because it wasn't framed as a malfunction. It was framed as a stretch of time that existed, the way afternoon exists, or dusk. That segmented pattern isn't the point here. Plenty of people today sleep straight through, and always have, and it isn't something to try to recreate on purpose. What's worth taking from it is smaller and simpler. The wakeful, thinking mind in the middle of the night is not a modern invention, and it is not evidence that something has gone wrong with how you rest. People lying awake with their thoughts drifting is about as old as people lying down at all. What's changed, if anything, isn't the phenomenon itself, but the story we tell about it. Somewhere along the way, especially once a good night's sleep became something to be tracked, measured, optimized, and compared against an ideal number of hours, a wandering mind at night stopped being just an experience and became a kind of failure, a sign of insufficient discipline, insufficient calm, insufficient whatever quality was supposed to produce 8 seamless hours of silence. But brains were never built for seamless silence. They were built to notice things, and noticing doesn't obey a curfew. So when that unfinished sentence drifts back through right now, and it may do exactly that, again, in a few minutes, it isn't a sign that you're doing this wrong. It's a sign that the spotlight, which worked hard all day, is still doing its job, just with the stage rearranged. There's nothing to fix in that moment. There's only something to understand, the way you might understand why a fan keeps spinning for a few seconds after you turn off the switch. Not because it's broken, but because it has momentum, and momentum takes a little time to settle. Understanding this doesn't necessarily make the thought disappear right away, and that's fine.
That isn't really the goal. The goal, if there is one at all right now, is simply to stop treating its presence as evidence against you. A thought returning at night is not a verdict on your character or your capacity for rest. It's closer to weather, something moving through, shaped by conditions, not permanent, not personal, in the way it can feel at 11 p.m. with the lights off. And once you stop needing the thought to leave immediately, something curious tends to happen to how it behaves, which is really a question about what attention itself is doing when there's nothing left to chase, and where it tends to go when it's finally allowed to slow all the way down.
Think for a moment about what a room actually gives up when the lights go off. During the day, a kitchen alone has enough going on to occupy a good portion of your attention without you ever noticing it's happening. There's the hum of a refrigerator compressor cycling on and off, the particular creak of a floorboard when someone walks past, a car passing outside, a conversation in another room, the temperature of the light changing as clouds move across the sun. None of it feels like input in any effortful sense. It doesn't feel like work to process a kitchen, but your nervous system is doing exactly that, continuously, the way a lighthouse keeper's eyes move across the horizon without the keeper consciously deciding to look at every wave. At night, in bed, in the dark, most of that simply isn't there anymore. The eyes have almost nothing to do. The ears might catch a car passing, but there's no traffic light to check, no task attached to the sound, nothing for it to mean. The skin registers the temperature of the sheets, and then, within a minute or two, stops registering much of anything new, because the nervous system is very good at habituating to a steady, unchanging sensation. Once something stays the same long enough, the brain essentially decides it isn't worth continued attention and quietly stops reporting on it. This is why you can put on a shirt in the morning and, 10 minutes later, no longer feel the fabric against your skin at all. Not because the shirt vanished, but because your attention did, redirected toward things that are actually changing. So by the time you're lying still in a dark, quiet room, a huge share of what usually keeps the mind occupied has been switched off, not because your mind decided to relax, but because the environment itself simply stopped supplying anything worth tracking. And this is where something interesting happens, something that trips a lot of people up, because it feels backward. You might expect that with less coming in, the mind would have less to do, and therefore feel quieter. Instead, it often gets louder. The thoughts don't shrink to match the room. If anything, they seem to expand to fill it. There's a reasonably intuitive way to think about why. Attention behaves less like a light switch, which is either fully on or fully off, and more like a dial that's always turned to some setting, always pointed somewhere. It doesn't have an off position, not really, not in a healthy, awake brain. It has to be pointed at something. During the day, the world hands it targets constantly, and without being asked. Read this sign, watch that person cross the street, answer this question, remember to buy milk, notice that email just arrived. The dial gets moved around by outside forces so quickly and so continuously that you rarely feel the mechanism doing the moving. It just looks like a full, busy day. At night, the outside world stops handing out targets, but the dial doesn't get put away. It still has to point somewhere. And with nothing external left to grab it, it turns inward, the way a compass needle doesn't disappear just because you've stopped needing directions. It simply keeps swinging until it finds north, or in this case, until it finds whatever is left standing in the quiet.
an unresolved conversation, a worry about tomorrow, a stray memory, the sound of your own heartbeat. None of that material is new. It was there during the day, too. It just had to compete for space, with everything else clamoring for attention, and it usually lost. At night, it stops losing, simply because it stops having to compete. This is sometimes described, a little informally, as the difference between signal and noise, though that phrasing undersells how much genuine, useful signal the daytime world actually contains. It isn't that daytime input is noise, in a dismissive sense. It's more that daytime input is varied and constantly renewing, so no single thought gets much runway before something else interrupts it. A worry that surfaces at 2 p.m. while you're crossing a street or answering a phone call gets maybe half a second of your attention before the street or the phone call takes over again. The worry doesn't get resolved. It just gets crowded out, pushed to the back of a very long line. At night, the line empties. Nothing else is asking for a turn, so the worry that got half a second at 2 p.m. can suddenly have 4 uninterrupted minutes at 11 p.m., and 4 uninterrupted minutes feels enormous, because it is, relative to what that same thought has ever been given.
There's also a simple, almost architectural reason. A quiet room amplifies things. Contrast. A single candle looks unremarkable in daylight and startlingly bright in a dark room, not because the candle changed, but because everything around it changed. A thought behaves a little like that candle. The thought about the email you should have sent, or the thing you said that didn't quite land the way you meant it, isn't necessarily more intense at night than it was at 3 p.m. It's the same thought. But at 3 p.m., it was one small flame among many, competing with meetings, traffic, the smell of coffee, someone asking you a question, and at 11 p.m., it's the only flame in the room, so it looks enormous simply by comparison. People sometimes interpret this apparent growth as the thought, getting worse overnight, when really, the room got darker around it, and darkness has a way of making anything look larger than it is, which is also, incidentally, why sailors for centuries learned to distrust the size of things spotted at night on open water, and why a small sound in an old, quiet house can seem far more significant than the same sound would in a marketplace at noon. None of this is a new discovery, even if it now gets described with more precise vocabulary than it used to. Someone lying in a dim room a few hundred years ago, with no idea what a nervous system was or how habituation worked, would still have recognized the basic shape of the experience. A busy day fades, a quiet room begins, and thoughts that had no room to breathe all day suddenly have all the room in the world. They might have called it a restless spirit, or an overactive humor, or simply a night that wouldn't settle, reaching for whatever explanation their era offered. The language changes across centuries. The underlying mechanism, attention needing somewhere to land, and the night removing almost everywhere else it could land, appears to be considerably older than any of the words used to describe it. It's worth sitting with the fact that this louder-seeming mind at night isn't actually producing more thoughts than it does during the day. In many respects, it's producing fewer, simply because there's less coming in to react to. What changes is not the volume of thinking so much as its visibility. Nothing is masking it anymore. During the day, thoughts move through a kind of noisy hallway, constantly bumping into other, more urgent business. A ringing phone, a red light, a coworker asking a question, and most of them slip by mostly unnoticed. Background traffic, in a mind occupied with other things.
At night, that hallway empties out, and every set of footsteps, even a very quiet one, becomes audible, simply because nothing else is walking through at the same time. This is a strange kind of stillness to make sense of, because it doesn't feel like stillness at all, from the inside. It feels like the opposite, like the mind has picked precisely the wrong moment to become active, as though it waited for the one time you actually needed it to be quiet, and chose that exact moment to start talking. But it isn't waiting for anything, and it isn't choosing anything, not in the deliberate sense that word usually implies. It's simply following the shape of the room it's been left in, a room with far less to look at, far less to listen to, and far less asking to be done, which leaves the attention that's been running all day with almost nowhere else to go but toward whatever is still sitting there, unfinished, in the quiet dark, waiting its turn. And once attention has nowhere left to go but inward, it's worth asking what, exactly, it tends to find there, because not all of what surfaces at night is equally random, and some of it, it turns out, has been waiting for a particular kind of quiet all along.
There's a useful way scientists have come to think about what the mind does when nothing in particular is being asked of it. And it doesn't involve imagining the brain as something that simply switches off once the dishes are done and the lights go out. Instead, researchers noticed something almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Back when brain imaging first became sensitive enough to watch activity over time rather than just in a single frozen snapshot, they kept designing careful experiments, asking people to lie still in a scanner and rest quietly between tasks, thinking of these rest periods as a kind of neutral baseline, the blank page against which the real activity, the task-related activity, would show up in sharper contrast. And then they noticed the blank page wasn't blank. Certain regions were busier during those supposedly empty gaps than they were during the tasks themselves. It was a bit like designing an experiment to measure the sound of a room and discovering the room was never actually silent, that some quiet hum had been there the entire time, patiently waiting to be noticed once everything louder had been cleared away. This network of regions earned a name that has since become fairly familiar to anyone who reads about the brain, even casually, the default mode network. The word default is doing a lot of work in that name, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. It doesn't mean idle, and it doesn't mean malfunctioning. It means something closer to what a river does when it isn't being dammed or redirected. It doesn't stop moving, it simply returns to its natural course. When there's no external task demanding a particular kind of attention, this network becomes more active, not less, and what it seems to specialize in is a cluster of very human activities, replaying memories, imagining future scenarios, thinking about other people's intentions and feelings, and turning attention onto the self, asking, in effect, how am I doing? What do I need? What's unresolved? None of this requires a task. In fact, it seems to require the absence of one. It helps to think of this the way you might think of a workshop at the end of the day. Picture a woodworking shop where, all day long, someone has been standing at a bench doing one very specific, very demanding job, measuring, cutting, sanding a single piece of furniture. That work requires the bench light aimed at exactly one spot, tools laid out for exactly one task, full attention narrowed down to the width of a single board. But the moment that piece is finished and set aside, the person doesn't vanish from the shop, they start wandering. They pick up an old project they'd set down weeks ago. They notice the pile of scraps in the corner,
and wonder if any of it is salvageable. They glance at a photograph pinned to the wall and think, unbidden, of the person who gave it to them. None of this wandering is unproductive in the way it might look from the outside. It's simply a different mode of being in the same room. Less focused, more associative, moving from one loosely connected thing to the next, because nothing is holding the attention in place anymore. The default mode network appears to behave something like that wandering craftsman. During focused tasks, solving a math problem, following a recipe, driving through unfamiliar streets, its activity tends to quiet down, almost as if it's stepping back to let a more specialized, more task-specific part of the process take over the bench. But the instant that external demand eases, it comes forward again, picking up whatever was left mid-thought. This is part of why so much of nighttime thinking has that particular flavor of loose association, one memory sliding into another, a stray worry, connecting itself to an old embarrassment, a plan for tomorrow, drifting sideways into a scene from 10 years ago. That's not disorganization. That's what this system does when it's given room to do it. There's a second system worth understanding alongside this one, because the two of them seem to work as something like a pair, or at least in close conversation with each other. This second system is sometimes called the salience network, and its job, in the plainest possible terms, is deciding what matters right now. Salience just means noticeable, or standout, the quality that makes one thing in a crowded field grab attention, while everything else fades into background texture. A smoke alarm is salient. A stomach cramp is salient. The sudden silence after a familiar sound stops, a refrigerator hum finally cutting off, is salient precisely because of the contrast it creates. This network's whole purpose seems to be scanning, constantly and quietly, for the thing in the current moment that deserves attention over everything else competing for it. During the day, the salience system has an enormous amount of material to sort through, and most of it gets triaged instantly and without ceremony. A car horn 2 streets over doesn't rise to the level of significant. A coworker's raised eyebrow might. The specific gravity of things shifts constantly, moment to moment, and this system is the one doing that sorting, mostly below the threshold of conscious awareness, so that the mind can move through a day without being paralyzed by every possible stimulus demanding equal consideration.
It's a kind of tireless, backstage stage manager, deciding what gets spotlighted and what stays in the wings. At night, this stage manager doesn't retire. It keeps working the exact same job, but the material coming across its desk has changed dramatically. There's no coworker's expression to evaluate, no traffic to monitor, no meeting to track the tone of. What's left, largely, is internal, a slight tightness in the chest that might be nothing or might be worth noting, an unresolved thread from a conversation earlier that day, a nagging sense that something on tomorrow's list has been quietly ignored for too long. The salience network still does its job of flagging what seems to matter. It just now has almost nothing to flag except the contents of your own mind, which means those contents get treated with an urgency they might not receive at 3 in the afternoon, when they'd have to compete with dozens of louder, more immediate things. This is worth pausing on, because it explains something that otherwise feels like a cruel design flaw, why a stray thought about an unanswered email can suddenly feel, at 11 at night, as pressing as an actual emergency. It isn't that the thought has become more objectively important, it's that the system responsible for ranking importance is doing its ranking against a nearly empty field. Something doesn't have to be very large to look enormous
when it's the only thing standing in an otherwise empty room. A single lamp left on in a dark house is far more noticeable than that same lamp would be at noon, surrounded by daylight and a dozen other visible objects, even though the lamp itself hasn't changed in the slightest. What makes this even more interesting is that these two systems, the wandering, associative default mode network and the ever-vigilant salience network, don't operate independently of each other. They seem to hand things back and forth. The salience system notices something worth attending to, and the default mode network is often what picks it up and starts turning it over, connecting it to memory, spinning out its implications, imagining how tomorrow's conversation might go if that email is answered the wrong way, or the right way, or not at all. One system decides what deserves the spotlight. The other steps into that spotlight and starts improvising, drawing on a lifetime of stored memory and association to build something out of what was, a moment before, just a flicker of noticed relevance. None of this requires anything to have gone wrong. It isn't intrusive thought in the clinical sense, and it isn't anxiety in the sense of a disorder, though anxiety, when it's present, absolutely can amplify both of these systems and make their combined effect louder and harder to quiet. For most people on most nights, this is simply what a brain does when the tasks of the day have ended and the environment has gone quiet enough to let its own internal traffic become visible. The self-reflection, the memory replay, the sudden vivid clarity about something that seemed minor 12 hours earlier, these aren't malfunctions in an otherwise well-behaved machine. They're closer to what the mind has always done in the absence of external demand, running quietly under the surface of every busy day, waiting for exactly this kind of stillness to finally be heard. And once you understand that these systems are always active, simply becoming more audible rather than switching on for the first time, a different question starts to matter. Not why the mind is doing this, but why some of what it retrieves at night feels so oddly specific, so strangely well preserved, as though certain memories had been kept in a drawer, specifically for this hour.
There's a particular kind of memory that seems to wait for exactly this hour, and it usually isn't the big things. It's the email you haven't answered, the permission slip still sitting on the counter, the dentist appointment you meant to reschedule 3 days ago. These aren't dramatic memories. They don't carry the emotional weight of a painful conversation or a cherished moment from childhood, and yet they surface with a strange, almost insistent clarity, arriving fully formed the moment the room goes quiet, as if they'd been standing just behind a door, waiting for someone to finally open it. In the late 1920s, a Lithuanian psychologist named Bluma Zygarnik was sitting in a Vienna cafe with her mentor, Kurt Lewin, watching the waiters work. What she noticed has since become one of the more famous observations in the history of memory research, though like most famous findings, the real story is a little more complicated than the popular version suggests. The waiters, she noticed, could hold an entire table's complicated order in their heads without writing anything down, tracking who wanted what, in what order, with which modifications, all while moving between tables and shouting things to the kitchen. But the moment the order was delivered and paid for, the memory seemed to evaporate. Ask that same waiter 20 minutes after the check was settled what the table had ordered, and there was a good chance he wouldn't be able to tell you. The unfinished task stayed vivid. The finished one dissolved. Zygarnik took this observation back into the laboratory, where she gave participants a series of small tasks, puzzles, simple arithmetic problems,
little construction exercises with beads and boxes. Some of these tasks she let people finish. Others she interrupted partway through, sometimes with no warning at all, simply telling the participant to stop and move on to something else. Later, when she asked people to recall which tasks they'd worked on, the results showed something that felt intuitive the moment you heard it. On average, people recalled the interrupted tasks noticeably better than the completed ones. Roughly twice as well in her original studies, though the exact size of that effect has moved around a good deal in the decades since. An unfinished task, it seemed, created a kind of psychological tension, and that tension kept it closer to the surface of memory, more available, more likely to be pulled back into awareness without any deliberate effort at all. This became known as the Zeigarnik effect, and it's been cited for almost a century now to explain everything from why students remember exam questions they didn't finish to why an argument with a sibling from decades ago can still surface in the middle of the night, unresolved, as sharp as the day it happened. There's something satisfying about the idea, a tidy shape to it. The mind holds a kind of open file for anything left undone, and that file stays open, humming faintly, using a small amount of background attention until the task is closed out one way or another. But it's worth saying plainly that the picture isn't nearly as settled as the popular retelling suggests.
Later researchers, trying to replicate Zeigarnik's original findings, got a genuinely mixed set of results. Some studies found the effect clearly, others found it weakly, or only under specific conditions, or not at all. It turned out to matter enormously how the interruption happened, whether participants experienced it as a natural pause or as something imposed on them, whether they felt they'd truly failed to finish or simply hadn't gotten around to it yet, whether the task felt meaningful or arbitrary. A puzzle interrupted by an experimenter who seems irritated produces a different psychological experience than a puzzle interrupted because the timer simply ran out. The tension Zeigarnik described seems to depend a great deal on how personally invested someone feels in the task to begin with, and on whether the interruption feels like an abandonment or just a pause. So the effect is real in the sense that it shows up, reliably, under the right conditions, but it isn't a fixed law of memory that applies evenly to every incomplete thing in a person's life. It's more like a tendency that context can strengthen or wash out almost entirely. What later work did clarify, and this part is where things become genuinely useful for understanding a wakeful mind at 11 at night, is a related but distinct piece of the puzzle. It isn't quite finishing a task that settles the mental tension, it's making a plan for it. A psychologist named E.J. Masacampo, working with Roy Baumeister a few decades after Zeigarnik, ran a series of studies in which participants were given an unfinished task and then, instead of completing it, were simply asked to write down a specific plan for when and how they would finish it later. That small act, the mere act of forming a concrete intention, seemed to reduce the intrusive thoughts about the task almost as effectively as actually completing it did. The mind, in other words, doesn't appear to be holding out for resolution in the narrow sense of a checked box. It seems to be holding out for a plan it can trust. Something specific enough that it no longer needs to keep raising the alarm. This connects to something researchers call prospective memory, which is really just the formal name for a very ordinary and very human capacity, remembering to do something in the future. Not remembering what already happened, which is what most people picture when they hear the word memory, but remembering what still needs to happen. Prospective memory is what lets a person walk past their car
in a parking garage in the morning and still remember, 8 hours later, without any external cue, that they need to buy milk on the way home. There's no alarm that goes off. No calendar notification. The intention was simply formed at some point during the day, and then, somehow, resurfaces at roughly the right moment, or at least close enough to be useful. Researchers who study perspective memory have found that it seems to rely on cues, some external and some entirely internal, that quietly nudge a stored intention back into conscious awareness. Sometimes the cue is obvious, like passing the pharmacy and remembering the prescription that needed picking up, but sometimes there's no clear external trigger at all, and the intention simply reappears, almost as though some background process were periodically checking a list nobody remembers writing. At night, with the outside world offering no cues whatsoever, no pharmacy signs, no ringing phones, no calendar notifications sliding across a screen, this background checking process seems to run without interruption, and everything it finds gets handed straight to the part of the mind that's already awake and already listening. There's nothing to distract it, nothing competing for its attention, so what it retrieves arrives with unusual clarity, sometimes even startling clarity, for something as mundane as a form that needs signing or a call that needs returning.
This is part of why the specific texture of nighttime thought so often skews toward obligations rather than pleasures, toward what's unfinished rather than what's already resolved. It isn't that the mind at night has become anxious or catastrophizing by default, though it certainly can drift that direction. It's that unfinished commitments are, structurally, the kind of information prospective memory is built to surface, and structurally, the kind of information the zygarnic adjacent tension seems to hold on to a little longer than resolved ones. The email, waiting for a reply, has an open-loop quality that a finished email simply doesn't have anymore. It sits there, not urgent enough to have prompted action during the busy hours of the day, but not closed enough to have been released from whatever internal tracking system keeps a quiet tally of things still owed. There's a reason this matters for anyone lying in the dark, running through tomorrow's obligations one more time, turning over the same 3 or 4 items with a kind of dull repetitiveness that doesn't seem to lead anywhere new. If the tension really is more about the absence of a plan than the absence of completion, then there's something almost mechanical about why simply reviewing the same worry over and over, without ever landing on a next step, fails to bring any relief. Reviewing isn't the same as planning. It can feel productive in the moment, like the mind is working on something, but if it never resolves into a specific intention, I'll deal with this at 9 tomorrow morning, kind of clarity, then the loop has nowhere to close, and so it simply repeats, the way a program might keep checking a condition that never gets satisfied. Which raises a natural question about what actually counts as resolution to a mind running these background checks in the dark, and whether the kind of planning that quiets an intention during the day works quite the same way once the lights are off and the body has already settled in for sleep. Now consider a slightly different kind of nighttime thought, one that doesn't just track unfinished tasks, but rehearses danger. Not danger in the dramatic sense, not the kind that makes the heart slam against the ribs, but the quieter, more diffuse sense of things that could go wrong. A conversation that might turn awkward tomorrow. A comment made 3 days ago that might have landed badly. A symptom in the body that's probably nothing, but hasn't quite been explained. This is worry, and it has its own logic. distinct from the simple bookkeeping of unfinished errands, though the two often travel together in the dark and can be hard to tell apart from the inside. Worry, as researchers who study it have come to understand, is fundamentally an attempt to predict and prepare for uncertain futures. It's not idle. It has a job. The mind that worries is, in a sense, trying to run a kind of simulation, testing out what might happen so that if it does happen, there will already be a plan, or at least a rehearsed emotional response, waiting. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because worry gets a bad reputation, and often deserves it, but the underlying mechanism is not a malfunction. It's closer to a smoke detector than a fire. The system that generates worry is the same system that once helped a person notice a change in the weather before a storm, or sense tension in a companion's voice before an argument broke out. It is tuned to scan for problems, and uncertainty itself, the not knowing, is treated by this system as a kind of problem worth solving. The trouble is that uncertainty is not always solvable by thinking. A person can turn over the same ambiguous text message 40 times and not arrive at 41, at some final resolved understanding of what the other person meant by it. There's no more information to extract. The thinking isn't wrong, exactly. It's just directed at a problem that thinking alone cannot finish. The way trying to sharpen a pencil by staring at it doesn't get the job done, no matter how carefully you look. And yet the mind keeps returning to it, because from the system's point of view, an unresolved social or emotional uncertainty looks a great deal like an unresolved practical task. It gets flagged the same way. It gets held on to the same way. The difference is that a practical task can usually be closed by a decision, while an emotional uncertainty often can't be closed at all until new information arrives, which might not happen until morning, or might not happen ever. This is part of why so much nighttime worry involves imagined conversations. Lying still, eyes closed, a person might find themselves rehearsing what they'll say to a colleague, or replaying what a family member said last week, adjusting their own response in hindsight, trying out a sharper reply, a kinder one, a version where they don't stumble over their words. This kind of imagined social rehearsal is not unique to insomnia or to nighttime. People do it walking down the street, in the shower, waiting in line, but at night, without the usual stream of incoming sensory information to compete with it, these imagined conversations can loop longer and feel more vivid, more consequential than they would in daylight. The brain, in a sense, is practicing. Social species have long relied on exactly this kind of mental rehearsal, working out in advance how an interaction might go, testing different responses before committing to one in the much less forgiving arena of real-time conversation, where words can't be unsaid once they're out. There's an old, very human logic to lying awake, refining what you wish you'd said at dinner, or preparing what you'll say tomorrow to smooth something over. It's social maintenance, run on a private stage where mistakes cost nothing. But the same quiet stage that makes rehearsal safe also makes it easy to lose track of time on. Nothing interrupts an imagined conversation at 2 in the morning. There's no colleague actually there to end the exchange, no clock visibly ticking down a meeting. The scene can be replayed and revised indefinitely, and because emotional content activates the same physiological arousal, whether the source is real or imagined, a rehearsed argument at night can raise the heart rate and tighten the chest almost as effectively as a real one would during the day.
This is one of the more curious features of the nervous system. It doesn't fully distinguish between a threat being simulated and a threat being encountered, at least not at the level of the fast physiological response. The imagined confrontation still floods the body with a small measure of the same chemistry a real confrontation would, which is precisely why turning over a difficult exchange at night so often leaves someone feeling wired rather than settled, even though nothing in the room has actually happened.
It's worth being honest here about a real and important distinction, because ordinary nighttime worry, however uncomfortable, is not the same thing as the sustained, often disabling pattern seen in generalized anxiety disorder, or the intrusive, looping self-criticism that can characterize depression, or the specific, often terrifying replaying of a traumatic event that can accompany post-traumatic stress. Those are clinical conditions, with their own distinct patterns, their own treatments, and their own understanding developed by clinicians and researchers over decades of careful work, and they deserve to be named accurately rather than folded into a general description of nighttime thought. What's being described here, the drifting worry about an ambiguous text message, the rehearsed conversation with a coworker, the mild, unsettled turning over of yesterday's small frictions, is something almost everyone experiences at some point, a normal feature of a mind with unresolved social information and no immediate outlet for resolving it. If worry becomes a nightly and prolonged experience, difficult to control, attached to a wide range of unrelated topics, and accompanied by physical tension or a persistent sense of dread that doesn't ease once daylight returns, that's a different picture, and one worth mentioning to a doctor rather than working through alone at midnight. But the occasional 2 a.m. replay of an awkward exchange with a neighbor is, by contrast, closer to background noise than to anything requiring concern. It's the ordinary hum of a mind that hasn't fully powered down its social monitoring for the night. There's also something worth noticing about the intention behind all this repetitive nighttime thought, worry included, because even when it doesn't feel remotely helpful, even when it feels like the mind is simply torturing itself with the same 3 unanswerable questions, the underlying aim tends to be protective. The system generating the worry isn't trying to make anyone miserable. It's trying, however clumsily, to keep watch. Historically, and for a very long time, a mind that stayed a little alert to social threat, that noticed when a relationship might be strained, that rehearsed how to smooth things over before they escalated, would have had a real advantage in a small, interdependent group where being cast out could mean losing access to food, safety, and cooperation. Being disliked by the tribe was not a minor social inconvenience. It could be a survival-level problem, so a brain that keeps a low hum of attention on, "Did that conversation go all right?" and "Is that relationship steady?" is doing something that would have mattered enormously for most of human history, even if, lying in a dark bedroom in the 21st century, with a phone silenced on the nightstand, it no longer serves quite the same urgent purpose. The mechanism hasn't caught up to the fact that being disliked by a coworker rarely threatens anyone's dinner. Understanding that the intention is protective doesn't make the worry disappear, and it isn't meant to. But it does change the relationship to it a little, the way it changes things. To realize a smoke detector beeping over a slightly burnt piece of toast isn't broken, it's just doing its job without enough context to know the difference between toast and a real fire. The question that naturally follows is what happens physiologically while all this is going on,
what the body itself is doing during these long stretches of rehearsal and worry, and why an entirely imagined scenario can leave someone's heart rate elevated as though something real were actually unfolding in the room.
There's a separate system running underneath all of this, one that has nothing to do with worry or memory or rehearsal, and it's worth slowing down to look at because it explains something that otherwise seems like a contradiction. A person can be genuinely, deeply tired, the kind of tired where the eyes feel sandy and the limbs feel heavy, and still lie there with a mind that's wide awake and cycling through the day's events like a search engine that won't stop returning results. That combination feels like a malfunction. It isn't. It's actually two different systems running on two different schedules, occasionally falling out of sync with each other. One of those systems is called sleep pressure, and it works roughly the way pressure works in most other contexts, building up gradually the longer a person stays awake. Think of it something like a bathtub filling with water. From the moment of waking in the morning, a chemical called adenosine begins accumulating in the brain, a kind of byproduct of the brain's own activity, and the longer the hours stretch on, the more adenosine collects. By the time evening arrives, for someone who's been awake since 7 or 8 that morning, the tub is fairly full, and that fullness is what people usually mean when they say they feel sleepy. It's a real, physical, chemical pressure, not a metaphor. Caffeine, as it happens, works by temporarily blocking the brain's ability to sense that adenosine is there at all, which is why a cup of coffee doesn't actually reduce sleep pressure. It just mutes the alarm that would otherwise be telling a person about it. The pressure keeps building underneath, regardless. This is part of why the caffeine from a 4 o'clock coffee can still be interfering with sleep at 11, even if the person feels perfectly alert in between. The adenosine is still accumulating. It's just not being felt. The second system is entirely different, and it isn't about how long someone has been awake at all. It's about time of day, tracked by an internal clock, and this is the circadian system. Deep in the brain, sitting just above where the optic nerves cross, there's a small cluster of cells that functions something like a conductor, keeping nearly every organ and process in the body on roughly the same 24-hour rhythm. This clock doesn't know or particularly care how tired a person is. It cares what time it thinks it is, based largely on light. And so a person can have a completely full tub of sleep pressure, can be as biologically sleepy as the day allows, and still feel keyed up and alert if their circadian clock believes it's still the middle of the afternoon, the way someone flying from New York to London might land exhausted and still find themselves staring at the hotel ceiling at 3 a.m. local time, wide awake, because some part of their body is still convinced it's an entirely reasonable hour to be up. Most nights, for most people, these two systems move in the same general direction, sleep pressure rising through the day, while the circadian clock also shifts the body toward evening and rest, and the two arrive at roughly the same conclusion around the same time, which is part of why sleep, when everything is working smoothly, can feel almost automatic, like a door swinging shut on its own. But they can also drift apart. A late nap in the afternoon, for instance, doesn't touch the circadian clock at all, but it does let a little water out of the sleep pressure tub, which is exactly why an unplanned 2-hour nap on the couch at 5 in the afternoon can leave someone lying in bed at midnight, circadian rhythm dutifully signaling that it's nighttime, while the sleep pressure itself is only half as strong as it would otherwise be. Most nights, for most people, these two systems move in the same general direction, sleep pressure rising through the day, while the circadian clock also shifts the body toward evening and rest, and the two arrive at roughly the same conclusion around the same time, which is part of why sleep, when everything is working smoothly, can feel almost automatic, like a door swinging shut on its own.
The body is in the right place. The tub just isn't full enough yet. Light is the circadian clock's main source of information about what time it is, and it's remarkably sensitive to it, in ways that predate anything electric. For the overwhelming majority of human history, the only strong light available after sunset came from fire, a source that's warm in color and relatively dim compared to daylight, and flickers rather than staying perfectly steady. Screens, overhead bulbs, and streetlights are a genuinely new kind of signal for a nervous system that evolved expecting darkness to mean darkness. Bright light in the evening, especially light with a lot of blue wavelength in it, the kind daylight has plenty of, and firelight has very little of, tells that cluster of cells above the optic nerves that it must still be daytime, and in response, it delays the release of a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin doesn't work the way people sometimes assume. It isn't a sedative, and it doesn't force sleep the way an anesthetic might. It's better understood as a signal, something closer to the dimming of house lights in a theater before a performance starts. It doesn't make the audience fall asleep in their seats. It simply tells everyone that the show is about to begin, so it's time to settle. And the pineal gland, a small structure deep in the brain, begins releasing melatonin as darkness falls, usually a couple of hours before a person's natural bedtime, and its rise is one of the clearest signals that the whole system sends, telling the rest of the body that biological nighttime has arrived. When that signal is delayed by bright light or scattered by an irregular schedule, sleep doesn't become impossible, but the invitation to begin winding down simply arrives later than it might have otherwise. Temperature plays its own quiet role in this transition, one that's easy to miss, because it happens gradually and mostly without notice. The body's core temperature isn't constant throughout the day. It actually rises and falls in a rhythm of its own, peaking in the late afternoon or early evening for most people, and then beginning a slow decline as night approaches. That drop in core temperature is part of what makes a person feel sleepy, and it's also why a warm bath before bed can genuinely help, though not for the reason people usually assume. It isn't that the warmth itself induces sleep. It's that the warm water brings blood toward the surface of the skin, and once someone gets out of the bath and that surface heat radiates away into the cooler room air, the core temperature drops a little faster and further than it would have otherwise, giving the body a small nudge in the exact direction it was already heading. This is part of why a bedroom that's slightly too warm can make sleep feel harder to reach, even when someone is exhausted. The environment is working against a shift the body is trying to make on its own. None of these systems, on their own, are the mind. Sleep pressure is a chemical buildup. The circadian clock is a cluster of cells responding mostly to light. Melatonin is a hormonal signal, and the drop in core temperature is a physical process involving blood vessels near the skin. None of it, by itself, has any opinion about an email that went unanswered, or a conversation that might have landed wrong. And that's precisely the point where these two threads, the physiological and the psychological, start to explain each other.
A body can complete every one of these processes correctly. The adenosine can be built up fully. The light exposure of the evening can have been reasonably dim. The melatonin can be rising more or less on schedule, and the core temperature can be easing downward, exactly as it should. The body, in other words, can do its entire part of the job. And still, none of that physiological readiness has the power to quiet an activated nervous system that believes, on some older and more primitive level, that there's an unresolved threat still requiring attention. The body can be standing at the door with its coat half off, genuinely ready to settle in for the night, while the mind is still pacing near the window, checking whether it's actually safe to sit down. That's the gap worth understanding next, the space between a body that has done everything right and a mind that hasn't yet been told it's allowed to stop watching. There's a particular kind of thought that shows up right at the edge of sleep, and it tends to be oddly specific. Not the big, obvious worry about tomorrow's meeting, but something smaller and stranger. The texture of a doorknob from a house someone lived in 12 years ago, a stranger's laugh from a train platform, the exact shade of blue on a sweater a coworker wore on some unremarkable Tuesday. These fragments arrive uninvited, and they can feel almost embarrassing in their randomness, as if the mind has opened a drawer full of odds and ends and knocked the whole thing onto the floor. This is worth slowing down on, because it points to something real about what happens to memory as a person approaches sleep, and it's easy to either overstate that process or dismiss it entirely. The truth sits in between, and it's more interesting than either extreme. During the day, memory doesn't work the way a filing cabinet does, with each event dropped neatly into its own folder and left there. What actually seems to happen, based on research spanning several decades now, is closer to a kind of ongoing renovation. Recent experiences get replayed, compared against older material, and gradually woven into the larger structure of what a person already knows and remembers. This reorganizing work doesn't wait politely for lights out. It happens in fragments throughout the day, in the pauses between tasks, in the idle moments during a commute. But something about the transition into sleep seems to particularly favor it, especially the earliest stretch of the night, and the lighter stages of sleep that come before the deeper ones. A person's attention, which spends the daylight hours acting like a strict editor, deciding what's relevant, what deserves focus, what can be ignored, starts to loosen its grip as fatigue sets in, and when that editorial control softens, older material and newer material get more room to bump into each other. This is part of why so many of the thoughts that surface at night have a certain quality of being unfinished, or oddly juxtaposed, or connected in ways that wouldn't survive a moment's scrutiny at noon. A worry about a work deadline slides, without warning, into a memory of a childhood bicycle. A conversation from that afternoon replays itself, but the words come out slightly wrong, reshuffled, as though memory were testing several versions of the sentence to see which one fits. None of this is malfunction. It's closer to what happens when a librarian, exhausted at the end of a long shift, starts reshelving books more loosely, grouping by rough association instead of strict order. A biography of a mountaineer might end up near a book about weather systems, not because someone planned it that way, but because the tired hand, reaching for the shelf, noticed a connection between the two, and let that be enough for the moment. The looseness isn't carelessness exactly. It's a different kind of organizing, one that values unexpected connections over precise categorization. Researchers who study this stage of the night, the drowsy transition between clear wakefulness and actual sleep, sometimes called the hypnagogic period, have found that people report a distinctive kind of mental content during it. Thomas Edison, according to several accounts from people who worked with him, reportedly tried to make deliberate use of this state. He would sit in a chair holding steel balls in his hands, positioned over a metal pan, so that the moment he drifted into deeper sleep and his hand relaxed, the clatter of the balls hitting the pan would wake him. Whether or not this specific habit meaningfully boosted his creative output is hard to verify, and shouldn't be taken as settled fact, but the impulse behind it reflects something people across many eras have noticed, that the drowsy edge of sleep produces mental material with a different flavor than either fully awake thinking or the thinking, if it can even be called that, of deep sleep. Ideas feel looser here. Associations that would seem far-fetched during a focused afternoon suddenly seem plausible, even elegant. This is one of the more consistent findings in sleep and creativity research, though the exact mechanisms and how reliably it can be harnessed remain genuinely debated among people who study it. It helps to understand a little about why fatigue changes the character of thought in the first place, and this is where attention comes back into the picture. Paying deliberate attention to something, holding one idea steady while pushing others aside, takes ongoing effort. It's a kind of muscular work, even though no actual muscles are involved. The brain regions responsible for that kind of top-down control, for saying yes to this thought and no to that one, are among the same regions that get measurably less active as a person moves towards sleep. So it isn't that new, exotic mental content starts appearing at night. It's closer to the opposite. The usual gatekeeping simply relaxes, and material that was already present, humming along under the surface all day, gets a chance to rise up because nothing is holding it back anymore. A person walking through their day has dozens of half-formed thoughts and stray associations that never make it to conscious awareness, filtered out before they can fully register, the way a radio might pick up dozens of frequencies but only play the one it's tuned to. At night, the tuning gets sloppier. More stations bleed through. This explains some of what feels so disorienting about lying in bed replaying a day. The content itself might be perfectly ordinary, an exchange at the grocery store, a passing comment from a friend, but it arrives without the usual framing that daytime attention would have given it. During the day, that grocery store exchange would have been quickly filed away, tagged as unremarkable, and released. At night, without that same filtering, it can surface again, sometimes on a loop, sometimes with a strange intensity that has nothing to do with its actual importance. This is worth naming clearly, because it's easy to mistake persistence for significance. A thought that keeps returning at 11 p.m. is not necessarily a thought the mind considers urgent or unresolved. Sometimes, it's simply a thought that happened to be sitting close to the surface when the usual filtering weakened, the mental equivalent of a pebble that gets kicked up by a passing car and just happens to land somewhere visible. It would be too simple, though, to say that all of this nighttime replaying serves some tidy, hidden purpose, that every scrap of memory floating through a drowsy mind is quietly being filed into long-term storage or building towards some useful insight. That framing is appealing, partly because it makes the experience feel meaningful rather than just noisy, but the science doesn't fully support treating every nighttime thought that way. Some of what surfaces is genuinely part of memory consolidation, the process by which the brain, particularly during certain stages of sleep, seems to strengthen and reorganize recently formed memories, deciding which details matter enough to keep and which can fade. But some of what shows up is closer to background noise, fragments loosened from their usual moorings without any obvious function, the mental equivalent of static that happens to resemble a voice. Researchers are still working out how to tell these apart, and it's an area where genuine uncertainty remains, not a settled account waiting to be summarized. What can be said with more confidence is that this entire process depends heavily on how tired a person actually is, and on how much deliberate attentional control has already worn down by the end of the day. Someone who has been concentrating hard since early morning
holding a dozen small decisions in mind, managing interruptions, keeping a lid on distraction, arrives at night with that control substantially depleted. Their mental gatekeeper has already been working overtime, and by the time they're lying in the dark, it has very little left to give. This is one reason a mentally demanding day can leave someone feeling both exhausted and strangely unable to settle their thoughts, which seems contradictory until this piece is understood. The body's sleepiness and the mind's capacity to filter and quiet itself are related, but they aren't the same resource, and they don't always run out at the same rate. Some nights, the body is ready long before the mind has finished sorting through what the day left behind.
There's a particular experiment that researchers have returned to again and again since the late 1980s, and it involves something almost comically simple. People are asked to sit for 5 minutes and think about anything they like, with one exception. They are told not to think about a white bear. Just that. Not a difficult instruction on its face. Nothing like memorizing a poem or solving a puzzle. And yet, reliably, the white bear shows up. It shows up more, in fact, than it does for people who are simply told to think about a white bear on purpose. The act of suppression seems to backfire, producing exactly the thing it was meant to prevent, and this pattern turned out to be so consistent and so strange that it became one of the more famous findings in the psychology of mental control. The bear is arbitrary, of course. It could have been a red bicycle or a particular song. What matters isn't the content of the thought, but the instruction itself, the command not to think about something, because that command turns out to require thinking about the very thing it forbids, if only to check whether you're succeeding. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something that happens almost every night to almost everyone who has ever lain awake trying to talk themselves into sleep. Somewhere in the process of trying not to think about work, or the argument from earlier, or the thing you said that you wish you hadn't, a strange doubling occurs. There is the thought itself, and then there is a second, quieter process running alongside it, one whose only job is to monitor whether the first thought has been successfully banished. That monitor has to know what it's looking for. It has to hold the forbidden thought in some kind of standby, ready to recognize it the instant it reappears, which means the very act of trying not to think about something requires keeping a faint trace of that something perpetually on file. It's a bit like being told not to look at a particular house while driving down a street. To obey, you first have to know exactly which house it is, which means some part of your attention is glued to it the whole time, even as you're trying to look anywhere else. Researchers who study this have described it as operating through two separate systems that don't always cooperate the way you'd hope. One system does the work of pushing a thought away, searching for something else to occupy the mind instead, filling the space with different images or ideas. This part takes effort. It's the part that feels like willpower, the part that gets tired. The other system runs more quietly in the background, and its entire function is to scan for the unwanted thought, to check periodically whether it has crept back in. This second system doesn't require much effort at all, which is precisely the problem, because it can keep running long after the first system has worn itself out. Late at night, when a person is depleted from a long day of exactly the kind of effortful control the first system requires, that first system starts to falter. But the scanning system doesn't need much fuel. It keeps checking,
keeps finding, keeps reporting back, and the thought that was supposed to be pushed away, instead, seems to arrive with startling regularity, almost as if the mind were sneaking looks at it every few seconds to make sure it's still gone. There's an old habit, common in quiet rooms and libraries, of trying not to notice a ticking clock. The moment someone says, "Don't listen to that clock," the ticking becomes the loudest thing in the room. Before the instruction, the ticking was simply part of the background, unremarkable, filtered out along with the hum of a refrigerator or the distant sound of traffic. After the instruction, a checking process switches on, something that periodically asks, "Is the ticking still there?" And each time it asks, the answer arrives freshly, as though for the first time. The clock hasn't changed. What's changed is the presence of a system devoted to monitoring it. Thoughts at night work in something like this way. The mind lying in the dark, having just told itself to stop thinking about tomorrow's schedule, or an unresolved conversation, or a nagging worry about money, now has a quiet sentry stationed at the door of that worry, checking in periodically, and each check counts as a small return of the very thought it was meant to keep at bay. What makes this worse, rather than simply neutral, is what tends to happen emotionally once a person notices the pattern repeating. The first time a banished thought sneaks back in, there might be mild annoyance. The second time, more annoyance. By the fifth or sixth time, something sharper tends to creep in, a kind of exasperation with oneself, a feeling close to failure, as though there's a test being taken, and it keeps being failed. This frustration is not a neutral bystander. It has its own physiological signature, a small tightening, a faint quickening of the heart, a subtle rise in the kind of internal alertness that the body associates with problems needing to be solved, rather than with rest. Frustration, even mild frustration, is a form of arousal, and arousal is precisely the wrong ingredient for the state a sleeping body needs to enter. So a kind of loop begins to form. The unwanted thought returns. Its return produces frustration. The frustration produces a small physiological nudge toward alertness, and that alertness makes the mind slightly more primed to notice the next return of the thought, which arrives again, restarting the cycle with a bit more charge behind it than before.
This is part of why simply trying harder rarely works as a strategy for falling asleep, and it's worth being honest about that, instead of pretending willpower is the missing ingredient. Effort of the kind used to solve a problem, push through a difficult task, or override a bad habit is fundamentally a waking, engaged, goal-directed kind of effort. It recruits exactly the parts of the nervous system that need to quiet down for sleep to arrive. There's a wry line attributed to various sleep researchers over the decades, phrased slightly differently each time, but always landing on the same idea, that sleep is the only state a person cannot force their way into by wanting it badly enough. You can force yourself to stay awake. You can force yourself to sit still. You cannot force the specific loosening of attention and control that sleep actually requires, because the forcing itself is the opposite of that loosening. It's a bit like trying to fall rather than jump. Jumping is active, a decision executed by muscle. Falling requires letting go of the very control that jumping depends on. Ask someone to fall asleep the way they'd complete an assignment, with focus and determination, and they'll often find themselves more awake at the end of the effort than they were at the start. There's also a strange irony buried in what happens when someone lies in bed, specifically monitoring whether they're falling asleep yet.
That monitoring is itself a form of the same checking process that haunts the thought suppression experiments. Just as trying not to think about a bear requires periodically checking for the bear, trying to fall asleep requires periodically checking whether sleep has arrived, and each check is, definitionally, a moment of wakefulness. You cannot check on your own unconsciousness without being conscious enough to perform the check. This produces a peculiar kind of noticing that wouldn't exist otherwise, an awareness of one's own wakefulness that grows more vivid the more anxiously it's tracked. Someone who isn't trying particularly hard to fall asleep, who has simply gotten into bed without much fuss, tends not to notice each individual minute passing. Someone who is trying very hard, who keeps glancing at the question, "Am I asleep yet?" ends up manufacturing exactly the kind of small, repeated wakeful moments that make the wait feel longer and more effortful than it would otherwise be. The clock on the nightstand becomes the outer version of the same inner process, each glance at the time functioning as one more check, one more brief return to alertness, dressed up as an innocent question. None of this means a person is doing something wrong by noticing they're awake, or by having a thought return after trying to dismiss it. It's closer to a structural fact about how attention and monitoring are built, one that applies to nearly everyone in more or less the same way. Understanding why the checking happens tends to loosen its grip a little, if only because it stops feeling like a personal failure and starts to look more like a shared, almost universal quirk of how minds try to control themselves. And once frustration is taken out of the equation, or at least eased, there's a related question worth turning to next, which has to do with what actually happens to the sense of time itself once a person stops watching the clock and starts drifting in that stranger, less linear stretch just before sleep finally closes over.
It's worth pausing here to ask why some nights feel like slipping underwater and others feel like standing fully dressed at the shallow end, refusing to go in. Because the machinery described so far, the checking, the monitoring, the strange loop of trying not to notice you're awake, doesn't operate at the same intensity for everyone, or even for the same person from one night to the next. A lot of what determines whether that machinery gets triggered at all comes down to a set of ordinary, overlapping differences, some built into a person's biology and some just accidents of the day they happen to have. Chronotype is one of the oldest and most stubborn of these differences. Some people are built, more or less from birth, to feel sleepy early and wake without effort before the sun is fully up. Others are built the opposite way, their body's internal clock running a couple of hours behind the standard schedule, so that 9 at night feels, to them, like 6. This isn't laziness or poor discipline, though it's often mistaken for both. It has a physiological basis, tied to the timing of a person's core body temperature rhythm and the release of melatonin, and it tends to be fairly stable across a lifetime, though it does shift with age. Famously, adolescents drift later, which is part of why early school start times have been such a persistent source of friction between teenagers and the adults who set their alarms. A late chronotype person, forced into an early bedtime, isn't failing to fall asleep the way an early chronotype person would in the same slot. They're being asked to sleep at a time that is, for their particular body, closer to mid-afternoon. The mind doesn't feel quiet because the clock hasn't actually reached their night yet. Stress works differently and less predictably. Where chronotype is a steady baseline, stress is a variable that can spike a normally quiet mind into a busy one almost overnight. A looming deadline, a difficult conversation left unresolved, a health worry that surfaces right as the lights go off. These don't just add extra thoughts to the cue, they change the chemistry of the cue itself, nudging the body toward the same mild activation that would be useful if a person needed to run or negotiate or defend something, but is considerably less useful when what's needed is stillness. This is why the same person, with the same chronotype and the same bedtime, can have 1 week of easy nights and 1 week of restless ones. The room hasn't changed, the bed hasn't changed. What's changed is the invisible chemical weather moving through the body, and that weather has its own timetable, only loosely connected to the clock on the wall. Novelty plays a smaller but real role too, and it cuts in both directions. A new environment, an unfamiliar hotel room, a first night in a new apartment, can keep part of the brain on a kind of low alert, monitoring unfamiliar sounds and unfamiliar shapes in the dark, a vestige of a much older system that once needed to notice when the usual signals of safety were missing. Researchers have documented something they call the first night effect, in which one half of the brain stays comparatively more vigilant than the other during a first sleep in a new place, almost standing watch, while the rest of the brain rests. But novelty in the form of new ideas, a day full of unfamiliar information, can have the opposite problem, keeping the mind busy, not because it's on guard, but because it has more than usual to sort through. The way a desk, with more papers on it, takes longer to tidy before the light gets turned off. Irregular schedules complicate all of this further, because the body's clock doesn't reset instantly just because a person decides to go to bed at a different hour. Shift workers, new parents, people who fly across several time zones for work and then try to sleep on the old schedule in a room lit by the new one's sun. These situations put a person's intention to sleep at odds with the internal signals that would normally support it. Someone who works nights and tries to sleep during the day is asking their body to quiet down while daylight is telling every photoreceptor in their eyes that it's time to be alert. It isn't that their mind is somehow more talkative than anyone else's. It's that their environment is actively arguing with their attempt to rest, and minds tend to stay a little busier in the middle of an argument. Caffeine and alcohol deserve mention, not because their effects are mysterious, but because their timing is so often misjudged. Caffeine has a half-life that for many people sits somewhere around 5 or 6 hours, meaning a cup of coffee at 3 in the afternoon can still have a meaningful amount of it circulating at 9 or 10 that night, quietly blocking the receptors that would otherwise let a chemical called adenosine build the pressure toward sleepiness. Alcohol is trickier still because it can make falling asleep easier at first, only for its effects to reverse in the second half of the night, fragmenting sleep and, in many people, producing exactly the kind of wakeful, thought-churning, middle-of-the-night stretch this entire narration keeps circling back to. A person who has 1 glass of wine and wakes at 3 in the morning with their mind unusually active isn't imagining a connection that isn't there. The chemistry of the evening is still finishing its business while they lie there, hours after the glass was set down. Screens and light belong in this same category of things whose timing matters more than their mere presence. It isn't that a phone is inherently sleep hostile, it's that certain wavelengths of light, particularly on the bluer end of the spectrum, are especially good at telling the brain's master clock that it's still daytime, which delays the release of melatonin
and can push the whole system's readiness for sleep later than it would otherwise be. A bright kitchen at midnight does something similar. This is less about any one device being an enemy, and more about how thoroughly modern life has filled the evening with artificial daylight, in a way that earlier generations, lit mostly by fire and then by comparatively dim electric bulbs, simply never experienced. Then there are the more physical situational differences: pain, noise, the demands of caring for someone else in the night. Chronic pain doesn't just hurt, it recruits attention in the same insistent way a smoke alarm does, and attention recruited by pain is attention not available for the kind of settling that sleep requires. Noise does something related, keeping part of the auditory system on alert even during sleep itself, which is part of why unfamiliar or unpredictable sounds are more disruptive than steady, familiar ones, even at the same volume. And caregiving, for an infant, an aging parent, anyone whose needs might arise suddenly in the night, puts a person in a state that resembles a milder, more chronic version of that first night vigilance, one ear effectively on duty long after the rest of the body has gone to bed. Travel folds several of these together at once: a shifted clock, an unfamiliar room, disrupted routine, sometimes caffeine taken at odd hours to cope with jet lag, sometimes alcohol on the flight to try to induce sleep that ends up backfiring hours later. It's a useful case precisely because it shows how rarely any of these factors act alone. Most restless nights aren't explained by a single cause, but by several of these ordinary variables stacking on top of each other, each one nudging the system a little further from quiet. Which is really the answer to the puzzle of why the same person can be a peaceful sleeper on Tuesday and a restless one on Thursday, with no dramatic story to explain the difference. The mind that lies down at night isn't a fixed instrument playing the same note regardless of conditions. It's more like a sensitive recording device, picking up whatever residue the day left behind: the coffee, the argument, the new bed, the light still lingering in the room, and it's worth turning next to how the body itself, and not just the mind, carries its own quieter record of the day into the night.
If you wanted to actually study this, though, and not just live it, you'd run into a problem almost immediately, one that researchers have been circling for well over a century. The problem is simple to state and hard to solve. The thing you want to measure, a racing mind at bedtime, happens in private, in the dark, inside a single skull, at the exact moment a person is trying to stop paying attention to it. You can't watch it from across the room. You can't even fully watch it from inside your own head without disturbing it, the way checking whether you're falling asleep tends to wake you up a little. So the history of trying to understand bedtime thought is really a history of trying to build instruments clever enough to catch something that resists being caught. The earliest attempts were almost embarrassingly simple, and worth respecting for that simplicity. 19th century physicians and a handful of curious laypeople kept what amounted to sleep diaries, written accounts of when they went to bed, how long they believed it took to fall asleep, how many times they woke, how they felt the next morning. This sounds primitive, and in some ways it was, but it established something important that later science would spend decades rediscovering: that a person's own report of their night, however imperfect, contains real information. The trouble, of course, is that memory of the night is being generated by the very organ that was supposedly offline for most of it. People routinely overestimate how long they lay awake and underestimate how much they actually slept, because the mind has no reliable clock for measuring its own absence. If you ask someone who slept a solid 6 hours but woke twice for a minute or two, they may report having barely slept at all, since it's the waking moments, not the sleeping ones, that leave a trace in memory. That gap between felt experience and actual physiology is why the 20th century saw the rise of laboratory sleep science, and it's a genuinely strange chapter of scientific history if you look at it closely. In the 1930s, researchers began attaching electrodes to the scalp to record the faint electrical activity of the brain, a technique called electroencephalography, or EEG. This let scientists see, for the first time, that sleep wasn't a single uniform state, but a sequence of distinct stages, each with its own signature pattern of brain waves. Then, in the early 1950s, at the University of Chicago, a graduate student named Eugene Asarinsky was watching the eyes of sleeping subjects, including at one point his own young son, and noticed something that shouldn't have been happening if sleep were simply the brain shutting down. Periods where the eyes darted rapidly back and forth beneath closed lids, coinciding with brain activity that looked, on the page, almost like waking. This was rapid eye movement sleep, and its discovery upended the assumption that sleep was a quiet, low-activity state throughout. The brain, it turned out, could be almost as busy at 3 in the morning as it was at 3 in the afternoon, just busy in a different way and disconnected from the muscles that would otherwise act on it. This machinery gave researchers an enormous gift and, at the same time, a persistent temptation. The gift was objectivity. An EEG trace doesn't care what a person believes about their own sleep. It simply records voltage changes over time, and that gave scientists a way to check subjective reports against something more stable. Studies using this equipment confirmed, again and again, that people are often wrong about their own sleep in fairly consistent ways, which is genuinely useful to know if you've ever lain awake, convinced you'd had a completely sleepless night, despite feeling reasonably rested. But the temptation was to treat the brainwave pattern as the whole story, to assume that because a stage of sleep could be named and measured, the subjective experience happening inside it was now fully understood. That assumption turned out to be shakier than it looked. People woken from what the machine called deep, dreamless sleep sometimes reported having been thinking the entire time. People woken from REM sleep, the stage most associated with vivid dreaming, sometimes reported nothing at all. The correlation between measurable brain state and reported inner experience is real, but it's loose, more like a weather forecast than a law of physics, and any honest account of the science has to say so. Later technology tried to fill in the gaps between the fully equipped sleep laboratory and the ordinary bedroom. Actigraphy, developed from the 1970s onward, uses a small wrist-worn device to track movement, on the reasonable assumption that a still body is more likely to be asleep and a restless one more likely to be awake. It's cheaper and far less intrusive than a lab full of wired electrodes, which makes it useful for studying people over weeks or months in their actual homes, rather than one artificial night in a research building. But movement is a proxy, not a direct measurement, and proxies have blind spots. A person can lie perfectly still while their mind runs through an argument from earlier that day, registering to the device as calm, untroubled sleep. Consumer sleep trackers, the ones built into modern watches and rings, descend from this same idea and inherit the same basic limitation.
estimating sleep stages from movement, heart rate, and sometimes temperature, offering numbers that feel precise while resting on inference rather than direct observation of the brain itself. Alongside the hardware, psychologists developed a different kind of tool, experiments designed not to watch the sleeping brain, but to probe the waking mind's relationship to sleep. One classic approach asks people to estimate how long a task took, or how long they've been lying in bed without access to a clock, revealing just how unreliable time sense becomes in low stimulation, low light conditions, exactly the conditions of trying to fall asleep. Other studies have people press a button or make a small sound at intervals through the night, catching brief windows of wakefulness that might otherwise vanish from memory by morning, the way a dream can feel vivid at 4 a.m. and be gone entirely by 8. Cognitive researchers have also studied something closer to the racing mind experience directly, giving people word association tasks or asking them to suppress certain thoughts deliberately, and finding that trying hard not to think about something reliably makes that thing more likely to intrude, a pattern with obvious relevance to anyone lying in bed trying not to think about tomorrow's meeting.
What's notable, looking back across all of this, is how often each new tool revealed the limits of the one before it, rather than delivering a final answer. Diaries showed that people track their nights imperfectly. EEG showed that sleep has hidden structure diaries could never capture, but EEG, in turn, showed that structure and experience don't map onto each other as neatly as anyone hoped. Actigraphy made long-term, real-world study possible while sacrificing some of the precision of the lab. And modern brain imaging, when applied to sleep and to spontaneous thought more broadly, has added detail about which brain regions tend to be active during mind wandering without settling the harder question of what, if anything, that activity means for the felt quality of the thoughts themselves. Functional imaging can show a network of brain regions humming along together during rest, often called something like a default mode network, active when a person's thoughts are unmoored from any task. It's tempting to say, this is the physical seat of nighttime rumination, the place where all that circling worry literally happens. But this is exactly the kind of overclaiming worth resisting, because the same network lights up during pleasant daydreaming, during memory recall, during planning a vacation, and during quiet contentment, not only during anxious replay. A brain scan can show that something is active. It's much harder for it to say what that activity feels like from the inside, or whether two people with similar scans are having remotely similar experiences. This is worth sitting with for a moment, not as a discouraging note, but as an honest one, because it explains why so much about bedtime thought remains genuinely open rather than fully settled science. Researchers have gotten remarkably good at measuring the body's side of sleep, the timing of its stages, the electrical rhythms that mark them, the small movements and stillnesses that trace a night's shape from the outside. What's proven far harder is measuring the private, wordless, often wandering experience of a mind that hasn't yet let go, and that gap between what instruments can capture and what a person actually lives through at 2 a.m. is one of the most persistent puzzles in the whole field, which brings the story naturally to what happens when the mind's daytime habits of solving, planning, and worrying simply don't know how to power down once the lights go out. Given all that uncertainty, it might seem like there's little a person can actually do about a mind that won't power down. But that's not quite right. The uncertainty is about mechanism, about which precise brain process produces which precise experience. It is not uncertainty about whether anything helps. A fair amount is known, even if imperfectly, about what tends to make bedtime thinking looser and what tends to make it tighten its grip, and most of it has less to do with controlling thoughts directly and more to do with changing the conditions around them. Take the simple matter of an unfinished task sitting in the mind like a dish left in the sink. There's a reasonably well-replicated finding in psychology, going back to the 1920s, and a researcher named Bluma Zegarnik, that unfinished tasks tend to stay more vivid in memory than completed ones. She noticed, the story goes, that waiters could recall the details of an order right up until the bill was paid, at which point the memory seemed to evaporate. The tentative explanation offered since then is that the mind treats an open task as something worth flagging for attention, a kind of low-grade alarm that keeps quietly sounding until the task is closed out or at least acknowledged. Lying in the dark, with the day's loose ends still open, that alarm doesn't know it's midnight. It just knows the dish is still in the sink. One of the gentler responses to this isn't to argue with the alarm, but to satisfy the part of it that's actually asking to be heard. Writing something down, a worry, a task, a stray thought about tomorrow, has been studied under a few different names, and even simple versions of it, jotting an unfinished to-do list before bed rather than a list of already completed tasks, have shown in some sleep research to shorten the time it takes to fall asleep, at least on average, in the particular groups studied. The proposed reason isn't magical. It isn't that the paper absorbs the worry, it's that externalizing the thought, moving it from the internal, unbounded space of the mind to the fixed, bounded space of a page, seems to reduce the felt need to keep rehearsing it internally. The mind, in a sense, stops rereading the same paragraph once it trusts the paragraph has been saved somewhere else. A person doesn't have to solve the problem to get this benefit. They just have to note that the problem exists and will still be there, written down and unforgotten, in the morning. This connects to something a little larger, which is the general value of giving the mind fewer things to hold on to right before sleep. Human memory, even in its ordinary daytime form, relies heavily on rehearsal, on repeating something to keep it available, which is part of why a phone number recited under one's breath stays put for 30 seconds and then vanishes the moment attention shifts elsewhere. At night, in the absence of anything else to do, the mind may end up rehearsing worries the same way, not because it's malfunctioning, but because rehearsal is simply what unattended working memory tends to do with anything flagged as important. A written note, a calendar entry, a message drafted and saved for the morning, all of these seem to let the mind set the item down, the way a person walking might finally stop patting their pocket once they've actually checked that the keys are there. Alongside externalizing thoughts, there's the far older and more familiar idea of a wind down, a period before sleep that looks noticeably different from the hours before it. This isn't a modern invention dressed up as science. Long before anyone measured cortisol or brain waves, households across very different cultures built rituals around the transition into night, banking the fire, latching the doors, saying certain words, lowering the voice. What sleep researchers have added isn't the idea of a transition, but some sense of why consistency within that transition seems to matter. A body that experiences roughly the same sequence of cues each night, dimming light, quieting sound, a familiar routine of washing up or reading a few pages, appears to associate that sequence with the approach of sleep more reliably than a body whose nights are unpredictable in their shape. This is consistent with a much broader principle in behavior, sometimes called conditioning, in which pairing two things repeatedly, in this case a set of cues,
and the state of sleepiness tends to strengthen the association between them. It isn't guaranteed, and it isn't instant. But there's a reasonable case, drawn from a mix of sleep hygiene research and much older behavioral science, that a consistent wind-down doesn't just fill time before bed, it teaches the body, slowly, what bed means. Light deserves a slightly separate mention here, not because it's more important than everything else, but because it's unusually well understood, at least in its broad strokes. The eye contains, alongside the familiar rods and cones used for ordinary seeing, a smaller population of light-sensitive cells discovered more recently, in the last few decades, that don't contribute much to vision itself, but instead report brightness levels to a small structure deep in the brain that governs circadian timing. These cells appear to be particularly responsive to certain wavelengths, the bluer end of the visible spectrum, which is abundant in daylight, and as it happens, in the light emitted by many screens. The practical upshot, and this part is fairly well supported, is that bright light late in the evening, especially light rich in those blue wavelengths, can nudge the body's internal clock and its release of sleep-related hormones, like melatonin, later than they might otherwise fall.
Dimming lights in the hour or so before bed, then, isn't a superstition. It's a reasonably direct way of telling that ancient light-sensing system that evening has, in fact, arrived, rather than leaving it to guess based on a laptop screen that looks, to those particular cells, remarkably like noon. None of this, though, quite addresses the thoughts themselves once a person is lying still in a dim, quiet room, and the mind is doing what minds do. And here, the evidence, while less tidy, points in a direction that might seem at first a little counterintuitive, not toward fighting the thoughts, but toward a kind of permission. Trying hard not to think about something is a strategy with a long and not especially successful history. The psychologist Daniel Wegner ran a now well-known series of studies in the 1980s asking people to try, for 5 minutes, not to think about a white bear. Almost without exception, the white bear showed up anyway, often more insistently than it would have if no one had mentioned it at all. Suppression, it turns out, seems to require the mind to keep checking whether the forbidden thought has appeared, which means the mind has to keep the thought in view in order to police it. Applied to nighttime thinking, this suggests that clenching down on a worry, commanding oneself to stop thinking about tomorrow's meeting, may paradoxically keep tomorrow's meeting more present, not less. A gentler alternative, supported loosely by research into mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches to insomnia, involves something closer to letting the thought be present without either following it or fighting it. This is a subtle distinction and worth sitting with slowly. Following a thought means picking up its thread, elaborating on it, turning it over, arguing with it. Fighting a thought means trying to push it away, which, as the white bear studies suggest, tends to backfire. The middle path, sometimes described in this research as observing a thought the way one might observe a cloud passing, noted but not chased, appears in some studies to reduce the distress associated with intrusive nighttime thinking, even when it doesn't eliminate the thinking itself. The thought is still there. It simply isn't being treated as an emergency requiring resolution before sleep can be permitted. Attention anchors work in a related way, giving the mind something steady and undemanding to rest on, instead of either a blank void, which many minds fill with worry by default,
or a demanding task, which keeps the mind too alert to drift. Counting breaths, silently naming things heard or felt, without judging them, picturing a fixed and simple scene, all of these seem to function less as tricks that force sleep, and more as gentle occupations that keep attention loosely engaged in something low stakes and repetitive, the mental equivalent of a porch light left on, rather than a spotlight. The evidence here is mixed and often modest in size, and different anchors seem to work better for different people, but the underlying logic, that an idling mind reaches for whatever is nearby, and it's kinder to offer it something calm than to leave the space empty, holds up reasonably well across the research that exists. And then there is the matter of when a few restless nights are simply that, and when they've become something asking for more attention than a wind-down routine or a notepad on the nightstand can offer. This isn't a small distinction, and it deserves its own careful unfolding.
Most of the time, a few restless nights are just that. A late meal, a stressful week at work, a room that was too warm, a mind that had too much to process before it was given permission to stop. The body notices, adjusts, and within a handful of nights, the old rhythm reasserts itself without anyone having to intervene. This is worth saying plainly because it's easy, lying awake at 2 in the morning, to treat one difficult night as evidence of a permanent condition when it may simply be evidence of a difficult day. The nervous system has a memory for stress, but it also has a memory for ease, and most nights it defaults back toward ease once the immediate pressure has passed. The line worth watching for is less about how a person feels on any single night and more about pattern and function over time. If wakefulness at night has become frequent, most nights a week, for a month or more, and if it's followed by real difficulty during the day, trouble concentrating, irritability that feels foreign, a kind of fatigue that coffee doesn't touch, that's a different situation than an occasional restless night, and it's one where a conversation with a doctor or a sleep specialist tends to be more useful than another article of advice. This isn't said to alarm anyone lying awake right now. It's said because letting go of the pressure to solve every night alone is itself part of what makes sleep easier, and knowing there's a door that can be opened, if it ever comes to that, tends to lower the stakes of tonight rather than raise them. For now, though, let the room settle back into view. Not the room as a stage for worry, but simply the room as it is. The particular quality of dark that isn't quite black, the small variations in shade near the window where the curtain doesn't quite meet the frame, the faint outline of furniture that the eyes have long since stopped needing to study closely because they already know it's there. The ears, if they're paying attention, will find that silence is rarely absolute. A hum from somewhere in the walls, the occasional settling of the building itself, wood or plaster, shifting by fractions of a millimeter as temperature drops through the night, the same kind of quiet creak a old ship makes at anchor. None of this needs a response. It's simply the sound of a space existing. This closing return to the room is not incidental. Through this whole exploration, from the way silence seems to make the mind louder, to the way the brain treats unfinished tasks, like open tabs it can't quite close, to prediction and expectation, quietly shaping what gets noticed once the lights go off, to the shift in temperature and hormones that governs when the body is willing to let go, to memory doing its slow, unglamorous filing work in the background,
to the strange backfiring of trying too hard not to think about something, the thread running underneath all of it is that the mind at night isn't malfunctioning. It's simply operating with fewer inputs and more internal material. The way a room with the lights turned down doesn't stop existing, it just becomes harder to read by other means. Consider the drop in external stimulation. During the day, the senses are so busy processing the outside world, footsteps, traffic, conversation, the changing angle of light, that there's little spare processing capacity left for internal narration. At night, most of that traffic disappears, and the brain, which is fundamentally not built for idling, redirects its attention inward, the way water finds a new channel when the old one is blocked. This is not the mind turning against its owner. It's the mind doing what minds do, filling available capacity, only now, the available capacity happens to be facing inward rather than outward, toward a half-finished email or an old conversation instead of toward the room. Consider, too, the way unfinished business seems to linger with a kind of insistence that finished business doesn't. A task left undone, a decision left unmade, a sentence someone said that never got answered. All of these seem to occupy a slightly different category of memory than tasks that have been closed out, something researchers have connected to a tendency for the mind to hold on to the incomplete a little more tightly than the complete, as though completion itself were a kind of permission to file something away. At night, with nothing else competing for attention, these unfinished loops tend to surface, not because the night manufactures new problems, but because it removes the noise that usually kept them below the surface during the day. Consider prediction as well, that quiet machinery, humming under conscious awareness, constantly comparing what is happening against what was expected to happen. In darkness and in quiet, prediction has less real sensory information to work with, so it fills gaps more actively, sometimes with imagined sound, sometimes with imagined scenarios about tomorrow, sometimes with old memories dressed up as present concerns. This isn't the mind being irrational, it's the mind doing the very ordinary work of trying to anticipate what comes next, only now working with less to go on, the way a lighthouse keeper on a foggy night strains harder to make sense of shapes that would be perfectly obvious in daylight. Consider the biological transition into sleep itself, the falling core temperature, the rising melatonin, the quieting of one arousal system and the slow ascent of another, a process that in most people takes time and doesn't announce itself with a switch flipping cleanly from awake to asleep. There's an interval, sometimes brief and sometimes stretched uncomfortably long, when the body is partway toward rest but the mind hasn't caught up yet, and that interval is exactly the space where thoughts tend to feel loudest, not because anything has gone wrong, but because that gap is where the entire process, biologically, is supposed to happen.
Consider memory's nightly housekeeping, the quiet sorting and consolidating that seems to happen during and around sleep, strengthening some traces, letting others fade, occasionally surfacing old material in the process, the way clearing out a drawer sometimes turns up an old photograph nobody was looking for. And consider, finally, the paradox of trying not to think about something, the way suppression tends to summon exactly what it was meant to banish, an experience familiar to anyone who has ever tried very hard not to think of a particular color, a particular face, a particular white bear. None of these explanations were offered as fixes, and none of them need to be remembered or applied like a checklist right now. They were offered slowly, the way this kind of understanding tends to work best, not because knowing the mechanism will switch off the mind on command, but because understanding tends to lower the stakes of the experience itself. A thought at midnight that seems urgent and singular can, with a little context, be recognized as something closer to ordinary, a predictable output of a mind doing what minds reliably do when given quiet, and a body not yet ready to rest. That recognition alone often does more good than any single trick, because it removes the second layer of distress, the worry about the worry, the frustration about the wakefulness, the fear that something is uniquely wrong with this particular mind on this particular night. So if a thought is present right now, there's no need to finish it, no need to solve it, answer it, or organize it into something tidy before sleep is allowed to happen. It can simply be there, the way the hum in the walls is there, the way the shape of the furniture in the dark is there, present, without requiring anything further. The room is still here. The breath is still moving, slower now than it was an hour ago, quieter than it will be in the morning. Nothing needs deciding tonight. Whatever loop is still open can stay open a little longer. It will still be there tomorrow, most likely smaller than it feels right now. The way most things looked at again in daylight tend to shrink back down to their actual size. Let the weight of the blanket be the only weight that matters for now. Let the dark stay soft rather than empty. Let the mind, if it wanders, wander without an escort, without a request to explain itself, without a job to finish before it's allowed to rest. There will be time for all of it later, in daylight, with coffee, with a clearer head and less at stake. For now, none of it has to be carried any further than this pillow. Rest well.